It's only about a paragraph long, which is very interesting because it's one of these examples where it's like a genie, the story. There's so much condensed into it that it's almost unbelievable. And there's even ambiguity condensed into it, which is very, very interesting because it actually makes the story more complex and sophisticated. So let me tell you the story. Now, the first thing, I want to tell you some things about the story first. So we've got the original paradisal state and then the collapse. And so now, metaphysically speaking, we're in the collapse. We're in the post-fall condition. We're still occupying a mythological landscape, right? This isn't history as we normally understand it. It's meta-history. So when we talk about Cain and Abel, we're actually talking about the first two real human beings. Because Adam and Eve, A, were created by God, and B, were in paradise. And so that's not the normative condition of human beings, right? That's a special time that's outside of normal time and space. Cain and Abel, by contrast, they're in history, because in some sense, history actually starts a couple of times in the Old Testament, right? It starts with the creation of being, it starts with the formation of the garden, it starts with the fall, it starts with Cain and Abel, it starts over again with Noah, and then it starts with Abraham, which is really where what we would recognize more as conventional history begins. So there's a number of starts of history, but this is one of them. Cain and Abel are the first two human beings. Who are they? They're the adversarial brothers. Hero and adversary. They're types of Christ and Satan. It's a well-known supposition. You see that hostile brother motif, well, it's an archetypal motif. And the hostile brothers are the part of you that's striving for the light, that's one half, and the part of you that's embracing the darkness. And so that's part of you. It's part of the social structure, that's Seth and Osiris. It's part of the natural order in some sense, that's the benevolent and destructive elements of nature, right? You see that negativity running through all the archetypal representations. But Cain and Abel are the hostile brothers, and Cain is roughly that part of you that says, oh, to hell with it, and means it, right? And that means you'll work for your own pain and destruction, at the same time that you're working for the pain and destruction, not only of your brother, but more particularly of the brother that you admire, because that's actually a lot more entertaining, right? If you're going to become destructive, and you go destroy something bad, that hardly qualifies as destruction. What you want to do is find something great and destroy that. That's destruction. That's revenge. None of this putting punishment where it deserves to be. What you want to do, and this is partly why the story of Christ is archetypal. And an archetypal story is when you cannot push beyond. What's the worst possible punishment? What's the worst possible punishment meted out for the most innocent person? You hit an archetypal end there. So you define most innocent person. You can do that any way you want. Define most innocent person, define worst possible punishment, conjoin the two things, you get an archetypal story. And the reason for that is you can't push beyond it. And so if you want to destroy something, you want to destroy an ideal, not something that's flawed. And so Cain and Abel are set up exactly that way. So I'll read you the story and I'll interleave some interpretations along with it. So, and Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Okay, so Abel's a shepherd, and Cain is a farmer. The shepherd is an archetypal symbol, because the shepherd is the leader of a flock. And the shepherd is the heroic leader of a flock. And the reason, this is Middle Eastern mythology, let's say, well, if you were a shepherd, what did you do? You took your slingshot and your stick and you defended your nice, juicy, plump, delicious sheep against lions, right? So it was no joke, man. You were a tough cookie if you were a shepherd, because, well, you were acting as the guardian you were acting as the guardian against predation, roughly speaking, and you weren't armed very well. I mean, well, you can just think about it for a minute. It's to think about fighting off a lion with a slingshot or with a bow and arrow or with a spear. I mean, you have to have a lot of courage to manage that, especially successfully. So Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain was a tiller of the ground, which isn't as heroic a role. And so right off the bat, you get this dichotomy between the two roles. It's also of great interest that Cain is the older brother and Abel is the younger brother. And you see that very frequently in mythology, because the older brother is the one that's privileged by status, right? So he's got privilege, Kane, because he's the elder brother. That also means that if there are possessions to be handed down the generations, the older brother gets them. Now, interestingly enough, Kane has privilege, but he's not the one that's favored by God. And I think that's absolutely brilliant that it's set up that way, because it's actually Abel who doesn't have the right that the firstborn has, who actually turns into the person who's the proper manifestation of the ideal. It's because Cain has things given to him. You might think, well, that's great, he's privileged, what a wonderful thing for Cain. It's like, don't be so sure about that. And partly because one of the things that you'll find, because many of you will be well off when you have children, is one of the problems with being reasonably wealthy when you have children is that you deprive them of privation. Because a lot of what makes people mature is necessity. And if you have, for example, if you have more money than you know what to do with, roughly speaking, it's very difficult to say no to your children when they want something. Because why are you going to say no? You can just provide it. Well, what makes you think that that's what you should do? Well, you can have anything you want. Well, what happens? You devalue what you want, and your desires continue to grow. Well, that's not very helpful. So it's not obvious at all that providing people with an excess, let's say, of privilege is something that's good for them from a psychological perspective. They need to hit the proper limitations. And if you're fortunate, it becomes very difficult to deprive your children properly. So you'll fight with that. It's a big problem. And that's what happens when you get spoiled children, roughly speaking. Right? They get everything by doing nothing. Well, that's not a good lesson, because that won't work in the world. It'll work very counterproductively. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering, but unto Cain and his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, angry, and his countenance fell. Okay, so again, there's a tremendous amount packed into that. This is the first time that we see the motif of sacrifice, right? And so I mentioned to you before how these archaic people conceptualized the world, right? It's a dome with a disc of land, and underneath that a disc of water, fresh, and underneath that a disc of salt water. So that's the world. And then up in the heavens, that's where God is. And so God's up in the sky, and we talked about why that might be, and part of that is, well, when you look at the night sky, you look at what transcends your current reality, and you look at what inspires awe. So there's God exists where awe is experienced. Fine. That's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis when you think that what you're trying to do is formulate what constitutes the transcendent. Because if you exist within a conceptual structure and you encounter that which is outside the conceptual structure, you will feel awe. And that's a combination of fear, paralysis, right? And a combination of overwhelming possibility. And you can experience that, for example, if you listen to a great piece of music. What happens? The hair on the back of your neck stands up. Why? Because you're a prey animal and you just puffed up to look bigger. That's why you have that experience. It's piloerection. And it's part of awe. So when you see a cat puff up because a big dog is in front of it, that's what the cat's feeling. It's like, oh my God, puff. Right? So when you encounter that which transcends your limited sphere of apprehension, then you experience awe. You look at the night sky, that's what happens. Music can do that. And all sorts of things that we do can evoke that sense. And so they located the transcendent value in that which inspired awe. Fine. Reasonable. Now you can argue about the utility of the personification, right? Because God the Father was personified in human form, but that's a very sophisticated idea too, because as we already found in the Old Testament, there's an association between whatever God is, Yahweh or Elohim, and creating order out of chaos, and something about each individual human being. And so I don't believe that the personification of God the Father in the Old Testament is archaic and primitive at all. I think it's one of the most sophisticated things that people ever developed. The idea is that the ultimate transcendent value is the capacity to generate order out of chaos using linguistic ability, let's say, and that each person has that as an essential element of their being. It's like argue with that, see how far you get. That is one hell of a vicious conceptualization, and I would also say it's the bedrock upon which our legal system rests. So you don't move that easily. You move that and many things fall. And there are things that you may say you don't believe, but you act them out all the time. In fact, if you didn't act them out, people would set you straight very, very rapidly, because basically what other people want from you, even though they don't conceptualize it in this terms, is that you accord them the respect due the incarnation of the logos. That's exactly what it means to interact with someone properly. So you can say what you want about what you believe. It doesn't matter. What matters is what you act out. All right, so now we have this conceptualization of what's transcendent.